Hello and welcome. The staff of the NIH Center for Scientific Review, or CSR, has created this program to give you insight into what happens during an NIH Scientific Review Group meeting or study section. We hope to convey the importance of preparing the best application possible to improve the chance your proposed research will get funded. Thank you for watching, and good luck.
One of my colleagues walked in and he said, "What's that you have in your hand? You look as white as a ghost." And I said, "I'm sure this is the summary statement telling me how the review of my application went." And then I looked at it and I just burst out laughing, shrieking, jumping up and down. It was totally undignified.
You can be somewhat angry and you feel rejected. But what you have to understand is the reviewers aren't critiquing you as a person. They're critiquing you as the investigator. And they're critiquing the way you're presenting your idea.
Look! Great job. We did it!
How well are you presenting your idea? How well executed is your application? What might reviewers think of it? Will it have enough scientific merit to be considered for an award of NIH research grant funds? This is a behind-the-scenes look at how the NIH establishes the scientific merit of applications for research grants. Our purpose is to reduce misunderstanding and clarify ambiguities about the process. In a typical year, the Center for Scientific Review at the NIH receives between 55 and 70,000 grant applications. Only the top 20 to 30% eventually earn support. While almost all applications are reviewed, the process is streamlined for efficiency and only the best applications are discussed at the review meeting. The most well-crafted applications, those that prompt high enthusiasm among reviewers, require just a couple of minutes of discussion at the review meeting to confirm their excellence. In contrast, applications with many flaws are often not discussed or scored at the meeting. These unscored applications will get full written critiques from 2 or more reviewers in their summary statement. The applications that receive the most discussion fall into the mid-range and display both strengths and weaknesses. About 10 to 15 minutes are devoted to these applications. Categorized by topic, applications are assigned to study sections or scientific review groups for the first level of review.
Part of the strength of our system in the United States is the concept of peer review. And what that means is that we're responsible for each other, in essence. We're responsible for the science, both to do it and do it well, and also to ensure that it's being done well.
The major goal of the study section is to ensure that all applications receive a thorough, fair, and objective review. One of the members of the study section, in this case, Dr. Dean Brenner, acts as chair and moderates discussion of scientific and technical merit. A scientific review administrator, like Dr. Sharon Pulfer, serves as the designated federal official. This person has the overall responsibility for the operation of the peer review meeting and provides orientation and clarification of NIH policies and regulations.
I want to welcome everyone to this scientific review group. I want to thank all of you for your participation and for taking the time from your very busy schedules to review these grant applications.
Dr. Pulfer begins by providing basic guidelines for the group. Principles encouraging confidentiality and discouraging conflict of interest are essential.
As far as conflict of interest goes, I'm going to read this because it's really important. Conflict of interest in scientific peer review occurs when a reviewer has a professional, personal, or a financial interest in an application. Most commonly, that's when an application is submitted by either you, a relative, a close friend, or a collaborator, or if you're listed on a budget page in any capacity. The second issue is confidentiality. I need to remind you that everything associated with this meeting should be considered confidential. If applicants contact you, please refer them to me and let me know that they contacted you. All material should be left in this room. The only thing you can take with you are your written reviews and any published manuscripts.
She continues by reviewing standard criteria. Significance. Does this proposed study address an important problem? If the aims of the application are achieved, how will scientific knowledge be advanced? What will be the effect of these studies on the concepts or methods that drive this field? Innovation. Does the project employ novel concepts, approaches, or methods? Are the aims original and innovative? Does the project challenge existing paradigms or develop new methodologies or technologies? Approach. Are the conceptual framework, design, methods, and analyses adequately developed, well integrated, and appropriate to the aims of the project? Does the applicant acknowledge potential problem areas and consider alternative tactics? Investigator. Is the investigator appropriately trained and well suited to carry out this work? Is the work proposed appropriate to the experience level of the principal investigator and other researchers, if any? Environment. Does the scientific environment in which the work will be done contribute to the probability of success? Do the proposed experiments take advantage of unique features of the scientific environment or employ useful collaborative arrangements? Is there evidence of institutional support? Human subject and vertebrate animal subjects. Has a compelling rationale for using humans or vertebrate animals as research subjects been presented? For human subjects, has the applicant addressed the adequacy of protection against risk, the potential benefits of the proposed research to the subjects and others, and the importance of the knowledge to be gained? In general, those seeking support are asked to be both innovative and rigorous. And the scientific review group, what's asked of them? Each one should be an expert in his or her field. Each, ideally, is conscientious, a thorough reader and listener, one who works well in groups and carefully considers the advice that he or she is about to give. An actual study section has 20 to 30 reviewers. For the purposes of this mock study section, we're using a smaller group of representative volunteers discussing representative grants. As many of you know, a K-08 career development application would not usually be reviewed alongside an R01 and an R03. For our purposes, 3 actual grant applications containing strengths and weaknesses have been modified. These changes have been made for the sake of anonymity and to make this program as instructive and valuable as possible. We've also edited and condensed the discussions to highlight those elements which will give you the most insight into the review process. But the overall flavor and tone are faithful to what you'd hear at a typical meeting. The discussions were not scripted. These volunteer reviewers were simply given the applications and asked to prepare to discuss them just as they would during their usual study section meeting. The observers sitting in the background represent the program staff from institutes that will consider funding the applications being discussed.
Our first grant to review today is an R01 Muldoon, primary reviewer Andy Yeager.
3 reviewers give their preliminary scores for this international multi-center trial.
Andy, what's your level of enthusiasm right now?
I gave it a 2.3.
2.3. Howard Kaufman, level of enthusiasm, please.
I was less enthusiastic, 2.6.
2.6. Donna Newberg, your level of enthusiasm?
I had a number of statistical questions, a 2.9.
2.9. Oh, down we go. Okay. Andy, can you take it over?
Sure. This is an application from a very talented and productive applicant and a very competent investigative team. The hypothesis that they're testing is that a selective inhibitor of cyclooxygenase 2, or COX-2, this agent RK42B, can inhibit recurrence of colonic polyps. A properly conducted trial of this sort could have substantial implications for prevention of colon cancer. This may generate not only descriptive data, but one hopes some mechanistic data. They've chosen an appropriate target population, subjects who are at high risk for colon cancer, an appropriate, I think, time period, an intervention period of 3 years with placebo or the RK42B. And this really represents some innovation. There are a few questions, which is where I was a little less than enthusiastic. Is there a scientific rationale for this intervention? Are the markers that they're looking at appropriate? The logistics of the trial, I think, require more information.
Thanks, Andy. Howard?
Okay, so I agree pretty much with everything that Andy said, but I was less enthusiastic for a few other reasons. First of all, this is clearly a strong group, and they've done a lot of preclinical work in this area, and I thought that was a major strength of the application. However, as Andy sort of alluded to, their justification for picking this particular drug, I think, was somewhat lacking. And in fact, their own preliminary data in Table 2, where they actually used their drug compared to Solandac and looking in a rat model of a barren crypt foci, it looks like there's really not much difference between these two groups. So I thought they needed to really strengthen their rationale for selecting this agent in the first place. As far as the trial goes, I had some major issues there. This is a group that has not worked together in the past, and they really have no track record for doing a multi-institutional study. I felt they didn't really support the feasibility of quality control.
Dr. Kaufman goes on to explain that much of the proposed methodology in the database are not adequately described in the application. The presentation of models is confusing and insufficient, and so it is difficult to evaluate how the investigative team hopes to analyze results.
In terms of accrual, they cite a number of centers and the numbers of patients that they've had, but they really don't justify these numbers, and they don't really provide evidence that each of the sites can accrue patients appropriately for this trial. I felt it would have been strengthened by either a more broad justification based on the literature or based on their own work in terms of how this drug may, in fact, be influencing colorectal cell proliferation. And so for that reason, I gave it the score that I did.
Thank you, Howard. Next, Donna.
Well, I was globally all right with their sample size calculations within the context of the assumptions they made, but I thought that there were some inconsistencies that troubled me. I really have to ask if their statistician is in close collaboration with the PI and really talking to them. Now, as I looked more closely at that primary endpoint, I got very confused. This study expects roughly 30% of the enrollees to be non-compliant, and they blur the distinctions between non-compliance, non-adherence, and dropouts. But basically, if you don't come back for your year 3 colonoscopy so they can check on recurrence of polyps, you're counted as a failure. They assume you have polyps. The criteria, as Andy said, are either one polyp that is larger or 2 or more smaller polyps, but I would actually like to know how many polyps the people entering the trial had, and when I assess how many polyps you find at the end, or how much. I think it's a much more complicated problem than they have given any indication of a statistical understanding for.
Reader is Sufan Chen.
I agree with their reviewers. I just want to add one more comment. One of their major hypotheses is that RK42B is protective because it decreases PGE2 production, which in turn will decrease cell proliferation. But their own data do not support this. In their preliminary study, PGE2 production was decreased, but the cell proliferation was not decreased. And in the application, they don't seem to have any alternative explanation if this theory does not work out what they're going to do. So that was my concern.
The discussion is now opened so that other study section members can question the primary reviewers.
I have a question. Isn't the fact that the effective dose of the drug has not been defined yet a major flaw, and that would suggest that the study is a little bit premature, I would say? I mean, wouldn't you go for a pilot study first in terms of defining which is the effective drug dose, and then go for the major long-term screening?
That's a very, I think, valid comment.
Following up on Gerardo's comments, I mean, Andy and Howard, did they really justify their dose with any rationale? I mean, did they say that?
I think they base a lot on the arthritis study, right, and they take the dose from there.
But you have no idea whether the arthritis dose is going to be useful in the gut as an anti-proliferative.
That's right.
So
even at the highest dose.
Yeah.
Even at the highest dose.
Well, you know, for all you know, the highest dose might actually be worse rather than better.
Yeah. That's right.
Nora?
From what Howard said, there wasn't even that good of a justification of the drug itself, considering that they looked at other inhibitors, and they seem to have similar effects in their animal models. So what I'm hearing is that there's problems with no justification of the drug, the dose, and even the statistical design of the study. It sounds pretty serious.
So this looks like a big trial, and they're asking to do 990 subjects. This is not ready for prime time, huh?
I think this is going to need substantial reworking and adequate addressing of the comments and I think some concerns that the study section has brought up.
Well, what are your thoughts about human subject protection, data safety monitoring?
There's a plan. There's a data safety and monitoring committee identified, but the structure of the statistical considerations doesn't tell us just when they will be approached, when they will be invoked, and what they're empowered to do. So I think more detail would be desirable.
In terms of participation of women and inclusion of minorities, this is very well addressed. The other issue, Dean, regarding participation of children. We know that children, adolescents who would fit the NIH-defined criteria of being under age 21 do have a risk for colon cancer, and this does exclude the known familial types of colon cancer. That is not adequately addressed. In fact, it needs to be indicated clearly that subjects in the pediatric age group would be eligible in this for this study, or adequate justification why they should be excluded. It's not as if this disease does not occur in that age group.
So that's going to affect the score some, Donna?
In summary, the group noted investigators had not met the NIH requirements for detailed documentation of protection of human subjects, nor did they justify the lack of participation of children.
Okay, then, with that factored into your scores now, how do you want to restate your scores for final scoring?
Well, I was previously at a 2-3. Having heard the elements of this discussion and these concerns that have been added in terms of human subjects, I'm going to come down. I'll be 2-7.
All reviewers present score each application on a 5-point scale. A priority score of 1 is best, 5 is the worst.
Convinced me to be more enthusiastic.
These scores are based on relative scientific and technical merit and reflect each panelist's best expert judgment. The priority score is converted to a percentile ranking, which reflects scoring behavior of the review group at this and 2 prior meetings. All applications, even those that are streamlined out of discussion, receive 2 to 4 critiques written by the assigned reviewers. The applications that are discussed and scored also receive a resume of the discussion written by the SRA after the meeting. The scoring continues.
2-7. Howard?
I think I'll stay at 2.6.
2-6. Donna?
I have not heard anything that would convince me to be more enthusiastic, so I'm going to stay at 2.9.
2.9. Sufan?
2.7.
2.7.
All right now we need to change focus. I want you to take off your RO1 hat and put on your KO8 hat, because we're going to review the Mentored Clinical Scientist Award.
Thank you, Sharon. We'll review KO8 Wayne Lawrence. I'm the primary reviewer, and I gave it a 2.3. Sufan?
2.1.
2.1. Donna?
Well, I'm the statistical reviewer, and there aren't any, so I'll give it a 3.0.
3.0. Okay. Gerardo?
I give it a 1.9.
1.9. Oh, a little spread here. Okay, then I'll begin and go over this application.
KO8 grants support the development of clinician research scientists. In this case, the mock study section will examine the candidate's academic and clinical record. They will focus on his potential to develop as an independent researcher, in part by critiquing his research plan and determining the level of institutional commitment to his work. Currently a senior fellow, the candidate, Dr. Lawrence, is well trained and ready to move in a new academic direction: regional vascular permeability and blood flow in the kidney of patients with square cell disease during endotoxemia. His 3rd journal article is about to be published, and he is the recent recipient of an NRSA award.
That's quite an impressive productivity for a young guy just coming out of a fellowship. And it certainly tells us that he is moving in the direction of an academic career. I think that this is really optimal for somebody like this, as he will be able ultimately to move towards a more mechanistic approach into these important physiologic things that go on in the kidney. And Dr. Mackenzie Liu is extremely well known in the area of blood flow physiology, particularly in the kidney, and appears to have been a really outstanding mentor for Dr. Lawrence. And
the young scientist has assembled an impressive team beyond Dr. Liu.
What he's going to do is he's really going to interact with them intensively, and I think that's a real strength of the application.
But Dr. Brenner has significant concerns.
He's not really thought about his outcome. I guess that's kind of a rookie mistake that we see on study sections, but maybe his mentor should have caught that. There are also a lot of details that I'm looking for in this grant that are missing. For example, how is he going to make hypertonia? Exactly what does he define as hypertonia? And how rapidly is he going to run the gradient to increase the hypertonia? Again, those kind of nitty-gritty details that you really need to know to convince us that he's really thought this through. Otherwise, as I noted, the mentors are very strong. The environment is really outstanding. There's a letter from the chairman of his department that I wish all my mentees would see, which says, we're going to promote him. We are certainly going to retain him. He's one of the most promising fellows we've seen.
Dr. Brenner would really like to support the application, but has concerns about exactly how involved the mentor has been up to now, a point demonstrated by the weakness of the quantitative analysis.
So overall, I think it's a great program, great training environment, strong support, but there are some weaknesses in this scientific project that reduce my enthusiasm. Next reviewer is Sufan.
Yes, I agree with Dr. Brenner. I think that all these studies are feasible and the experiments are within the expertise of the PI and core investigators. One is the studies in the M1 will not add much new information to our knowledge. For example, one study will determine the extent of increased vasal occlusion induced by endotoxin. And this effect actually has already been reported in previous publications.
Thank you. Donna?
Well, you've challenged me here to provide a statistical review of an application, and while I think it's actually a good application, I am concerned that the applicant neither addresses statistics in this application, nor is he entirely aware of his need of statistics. He does say, and this is his only, as close as he gets to this, that Dr. Dale, who developed the transgenic knockout mouse model for square cell disease, will train him in how to properly design and interpret studies that use genetically altered mice. So I think there's that appreciation, but what kind of differences am I going to be able to detect?
Like other panelists, Dr. Newberg has some enthusiasm for the application, but believes the researcher doesn't understand how statistical thinking applies to his work. She also thinks presentation of the markers chosen for the study is superficial and, in general, lacks detail. Dr. Vasta has a similar opinion.
I'm also concerned about the lack of detail in some experimental aspects, particularly in how the reagents will be used and what kind of reagents will be used. The source of the LPS, for instance, or endotoxin. What doses are going to be used. The fact that you're going to be using antibodies against the human homologs of the mouse, for instance, integrins, as a target for inhibition of adhesion. And finally, I think the major weakness of the proposal is the fact that as opposed to measuring expression or release of some of these cytokines or chemokines or surface expression of these adhesive molecules, I think the problem of this application is that you're not attempting, or the applicant is not attempting to figure out how they work, how they interrelate to each other, and in what sequence. I think the role of the mentor and the co-mentors in this case is also to help the applicant to identify a new area that's going to lead him to scientific independence. So they're going to still contribute in the scientific aspect, but they will also lead him to develop himself as an independent scientist.
Donna?
Well, I just wanted to respond to Gerardo. You had a very good critique of this application. but you gave it the best score. So I'm looking to be talked into a better score. I'm wondering why you were so enthusiastic when you had so many critical things to say.
The main reason for my score is the focus on the training environment. I think, again, the mentor and co-mentors are absolutely outstanding, and the institution is outstanding, and it shows tremendous commitment to this particular project. I would like to give a very encouraging score, but at the same time a very strong message that the experimental plan has to be detailed, has to be concise, has to be well crafted, basically.
I think to summarize, I think that the committee seems to be swayed more by the excellence of the applicant and the high quality environment and the kind of plan that he wishes to take over the deficiencies that we see in the application. So I certainly moved my score up to about 1.8 this time. Sufan, where do you go?
2.0.
2.0. Donna?
You know, I'm encouraged by it. I'll come down to a 1.9.
As you can see, the discussion actually brought the scoring recommendations of the panel closer together. This resulted in a better score for the applicant, a score that reflects the strength of Dr. Lawrence's training environment.
All right, we need to shift gears again, and the next application was submitted in response to a specific program announcement. The main thing you have to keep in mind is that these are for exploratory preliminary studies, so the budget is capped, and also the time is limited to 2 years. So please keep all of these things in mind when we start the review.
Thank you, Sharon. This is a grant from Thomas Westcott. It's an RO3. Nora, your primary, can you give me a level of enthusiasm? Score?
1.8.
1.8. I'm at 2.5. I'm secondary. Donna, where are you?
2.7.
2.7. Andy, where are you?
I'm about 2.2.
2.2. Okay. Go ahead.
So let me tell you why I like this proposal. This is a very simple phase 1 study of a cancer vaccine immunizing patients with advanced stage CEA overexpressing tumors. When you go back to the first aim, which is looking at the immune responses, it was really beautiful in the fact that he's looking at very highly quantitative assays. This applicant is actually using some new strategies. One is called ELISpot, and the other is intracellular flow cytometry, looking at intracellular cytokine production and being able to quantitate out numerically CD4 and CD8 T cells that are responding to antigen. These are new techniques, and although in this mechanism you don't really have to have a lot of preliminary data, he actually presents a significant amount of preliminary data demonstrating that he can do these techniques.
Actually, the RO3 mechanism doesn't call for preliminary data to support the research proposed. The chairman might have taken the opportunity to guide the discussion away from this point. Or the SRA might remind reviewers that preliminary data are helpful, but not critical for RO3s.
And what I really liked about the application is that throughout these very complex scientific studies, he had a lot of troubleshooting, what he would expect, not being able to get responses, what he'd see next. So clearly, even though this investigator has never published on these techniques, he really reflects through the writing in potential pitfall sections exactly what problems he proposes to encounter.
Dr. Desis continues her commentary. Some major downsides of Westcott's plan include deficiencies in structure, poor definition of assays, statistical weaknesses, and incomplete clinical trial data.
I think by far the weaknesses for me were the statistics. He didn't have a clear statistical definition of what would be considered a positive immune response. Again, there was some overlap with the assays on exactly what assays will be done. And in terms of the clinical trial, which I understand he has to do in advanced stage cancer patients, these are patients that are more likely to be immunosuppressed, so they'd be the exact category of patients where you wouldn't really expect to see an immune response.
Thank you, Nora. I agree with everything you say, and in fact, I just weighed it differently than you did. I think this was an extraordinarily novel and important approach. One of the things that we have in treating solid tumors, and particularly adenocarcinomas of the colon, is a lack of good therapeutic alternatives. And this is a very innovative, important therapeutic alternative. So why did I give it a 2.5, given all the things you said? And it gets to the clinical trial. It really gets to the design of the clinical. I really don't think he sat down and figured out what he was really after. He's treating a cohort of subjects who might not have that, and so he's going to get false data. I gave him a huge amount of credit for breaking molds and presenting something that I think could very well change the way that we approach colon cancer after surgery, but I don't think this is the way to go about it in the phase 1, and I think he really needs to rethink that. And that's why I gave him the 2.5. Donna?
Well, I actually am very gratified to see the effect of including a statistician on the review for each of these grants, because between Nora and you, Dean, I don't have to say a lot of this stuff because it would be repetitious. I was basically concerned that the application itself does not have statistics in it, that the statistics for the clinical trial are only in the appendix in the clinical trial.
Andy?
I think much of what I had made some notes on in my read have already been stated very well. This is a novel approach, an extremely well-qualified investigator, and my enthusiasm for all of that was quite high. That, on the other hand, was counterbalanced by what others have already indicated are some problems, some flaws in the design of the clinical trial.
Discussion? Nora?
One of the things that I think we often go over in these review groups is that when we review these biologics, especially in terms of cancer vaccines, we're used to looking at purified materials like peptides and things along these lines. This is going into a totally different concept. I look at this not so much as a phase 1 study, but as a feasibility study, allowing him to get the data to come back and write the real grant with the real patients. The same thing when we talk about putting parameters on these immune monitoring things. I kind of gave them a buy because these haven't been used extensively in humans before.
Other questions or comments?
Yeah, I had an opportunity to read this grant, and I liked it because I felt it was very responsive to the program announcement in terms of being a trial that was not just a clinical trial, although I do see the weaknesses in the trial, but that there would be an ability to get a lot of immunologic information out of the trial.
Others on the panel reinforce that it's important for applicants not to overstate goals. Is this an appropriate phase 1 study or an appropriate pilot study?
Can you restate your scores now?
I'm just going to put one last plea. I think that this is a feasibility study, and some of the things that have been discussed are not a fatal flaw, so I'm going to stick with the 1.8.
1.8, thank you. Well, I'm going to stick with the 2.5 because I believe there is a fatal flaw. He needs to write a pilot, and this isn't ready for prime time.
Sometimes reviewers disagree on the relative weight of each criterion for scientific and technical merit. How does innovation balance approach? This can result in divergent overall scores, as we'll see.
2.5. Donna?
I agree it's a feasibility study. I'd like to see it come back as one, 2.2.
Andy?
I'm staying at 2.2.
Okay. Bill,
there's a
much.
percentage of grants that we discuss at detail where the strengths and weaknesses are balanced against each other in review discussion. And the fact that 3 or 4 reviewers are assigned to each application means that there will be different opinions and different personal preferences as to how much weight to give one aspect or another of the application.
The discussions are over for the day. All applicants, even those whose applications were not discussed, will receive a full written critique comprised of the comments and recommendations of members of the study section. Scores will serve as a guide to the staff of the institutes who make the funding decisions based on research needs and priorities, as advised by their national advisory councils. So, what can you do to improve the chances that your application will receive an enthusiastic recommendation for funding?
There has to be a very clear picture of the background that you have and the fact that you understand, for instance, building in the proper controls, that you've considered alternative hypotheses and alternative approaches to solving the problem.
I don't look for correct answers. I look for innovative answers. I look to see whether an investigator is able to pick up new things and interpret them and go in a direction that it might lead them, despite the fact that their preconceptions might be different.
I think you can't overstress the importance of having as convincing a research plan as possible, but one that focuses on the key questions and sort of the proof of what I call the proof of principle.
Applicants should strongly state the contribution their study will make to the field, demonstrate a thorough knowledge of their subject and the literature, show careful consideration of animal and human subjects, present a well-thought-out budget, and reveal their own enthusiasm for the work in focused, thorough, and clear language.
The best advice I have is don't wait till the last minute and finish your grant application just before the deadline.
Many times we have issues of grantsmanship where someone has a really great idea but they just don't know how to organize it in a way that they can sell it to people who aren't in love with that idea.
If you follow the design of the PHS 398 and follow it to a T, you'll be much more successful than other people. So that's important.
If it looks great on the computer, read it again in a print, because things will not always be the same.
You need someone who can be honest with you, as honest as the critique you're going to get back after the grant submission. And by having people do it before you submit the grant, you're just doing yourself a favor in what the critique's going to be later.
Don't be afraid to call people at the NIH and ask for information. I think that was probably the most important thing that I learned. If you have a question about whether or not an institute would be interested in your project, call the program administrator there. And if you don't know who to call at that particular institute, most of the information is available on the web pages.
If you're not successful the first time, you're allowed 2 more submissions, and people should use those 2 submissions if they're getting positive feedback from the critiques.
Keep trying. If you get a score that the Institute decides is not a fundable score, read the critiques carefully, think about it for a while, try to step back outside of your own perspective and take a broader view of it, and then come back with a stronger application.
All I can say is that you sometimes have to be extremely persistent. What about when your research project wasn't going well and the experiments just didn't seem to be working right? Did you go away and give up in disgust? Of course not.
I think you heard in our review process that often we see weaknesses and still score a grant well because we think it has promise.
We would love to give money to people with good ideas. We can't just give money to people who tell us they have good ideas. A peer review committee is essential to that process.
Over the last decade, there has been tremendous growth in the numbers of applications submitted every year. This has been accompanied by rapid advances in biomedicine. Over that time, the Center for Scientific Review has been innovative as well. Now, all applications are scanned and digitized to allow all aspects of grant administration to be carried out electronically. And in 2004, for the NIH to begin accepting applications via the Internet. Already, we've developed an Internet-assisted peer review system. This production is part of our outreach to you, the applicant, to provide an insider's view of the proceedings of a peer review meeting, and to convey some tips on how to improve your chances of success in obtaining a research grant from the NIH. Understand that it is not meant to be a comprehensive overview of the entire review or grant-making process. If you would like to read a more inclusive guide, please refer to the NIH website, www.nih.gov. You can also consult the additional resources section on the Inside the Grant Review Meeting DVD. The applications and summary statements used in this mock study section are provided in both places as well. Thank you for watching, and good luck.